Okay, so just to give some context, I'm obviously speaking as a secondary school worker, so I'm aware that my brain hasn't been in primary when I've been thinking about this. So if anything I'm saying seems a little bit out of context for you, I'm sorry. I've tried to make it as kind of big picture as possible. So my opening statement is this, which is prayer is a pastoral activity. This may not be news to anybody, but I think it's a really important thing for us to remember when we think about pastoral care and prayer spaces, because it's not like we're trying to bring two different practices together. Prayer is pastoral, and I think we need to make sure that we've got that in the back of our mind when we then begin to think about how do we do pastoral care in prayer spaces, all right? And thinking about that shouldn't then make us be surprised that prayer spaces become pastoral places for students. They do. We all know that. And it shouldn't be a surprise because prayer is a pastoral activity, okay? And it also means that prayer spaces are a really good thing. I'm going to attribute this quote to Tim because it's controversial, but if there was no God, these would still be a good thing to do, yeah? Prayer spaces are still a positive experience for young people, whether they believe God exists or not, because we see them interacting with young people's emotions, with their frustrations, with their joys, and they're a great thing for their young people. So I think it's not a problem to think about them as a pastoral place as much as we think about them as a sacred space in any way. And the other thing to remember is that pastoral care isn't just about young people crying. Right? As great a story that may give you when you go back to your church and tell them about the number of tears that were shed, right? Pastoral care is about the whole of life. It's about the great joys of life as much as the sorrows. And it's really important to remember that as well when we think about pastoral care. We're celebrating the whole of life. We were just talking about my role as chaplain, and one of the great moments for me was hanging around at lunchtime, and I had a young girl run up to me and said, "I've got something to tell you." And I went, "Okay." And she said, "I've got new shoes." And I had to stare at the new shoes, and she twirled and she ran off again, right? That's pastoral care, okay? There was no tissues involved, but it was very important to her, okay? So the best example I can give, I think, of a prayer space being pastoral is a girl we had come in. She'd just got back into the school system from CSS. Now, is that a general thing, or is that just a SS? So it's for girls, well, not just for girls, for students who have just, the school system has completely failed them. They haven't fitted into any school. They've either got excluded completely from everywhere and nowhere will take them, or their school refuses. So CSS is intending its one-to-one school work, essentially, and it's trying to get students back into the education system. She'd come back into school from that, was sat in the pastoral office, refusing to go to any lessons, or refusing to talk to anybody. So naturally, they came to me and said, "Amy, why don't you take her into the prayer room?" So she came up into Sanctum, refused to speak with me, didn't answer any of my questions, so she just went round one by one, putting the headphones on and putting her hands in the stuff. And at the end, in complete silence, I said, "Would you like to come and write in the visitors book that we have?" And she just nodded and went and wrote, and then sort of went. And I went and read what she'd put, and she said this: "Thank you so much for letting me come to Sanctum," that's what we call it. "I feel accepted and I feel understood." I have no idea how she got that from silence, a whole load of tent poles and some post-it notes and some fairy lights. But prayer is pastoral, and that space had been what that girl needed. No words were said. So there's two things I want to look at this, two perspectives. The first is dealing with pastoral care within a prayer space. And that's kind of some of the practical stuff and some of the questions maybe some of you might have. And the second is looking at pastoral spaces as prayer spaces as a resource for pastoral care, which is maybe flipping it around a little bit. So the first thing, thinking practically, is remembering that prayer spaces are pastoral places. So when you're planning this, are you actually allowing yourself to think about the pastoral implications of the work you're doing? Or are you just going in with your kind of educational head on? And it's really important to make sure that you're thinking pastorally when you're planning. A number of ways that this is important. Firstly, to remember, and this has come up a lot as we've talked today, that prayer spaces are not about manipulation. And we are not looking at trying to goad young people into having an emotional response to the activities. And one of the ways to think about this is, how are you wording the activities you're doing? Does what you're doing suggest that there is only one way in which that young person should be responding? Because that's a really dangerous thing. And secondly, how are you presenting from the front? How are you explaining to young people what this is about? And one of the things to do is, at CYO, we always say, whatever you make of this room is completely up to you. And that's a really important message to those young people, to know that they're not expected to give any visible way of showing that they're engaging with it. That it's completely up to them how they do this. So just thinking about that. And I also think it's really important to make that clear, especially if you've got church volunteers coming in, maybe their only experience has been church prayer spaces, where actually an emotional response might be expected. So in school, it might be important to make that distinction that that's not what we're trying for when we're doing this work. Does that make sense? Yeah. And then the next thing is connecting with the pastoral work of the school. Now, I'm aware I don't know primary school systems, but in secondary school, as someone that works in pastoral support, they are the people for you to know. And I don't just mean know as in have a list of their names. I mean know as in their faces, they know who you are. So if you have a situation, you know who to go running for in the school. You're not just trying to find a name of somebody. You know where they're going to be, you know who's around, you know what day someone is in, and you know which room they should be in. Yeah, and it's just pastoral support, that's what they're there for. They want to be used in that way. And it's just really important to have that safety net that you know who to go to when something comes up. Because the last thing you want is to be panicking and feeling like you are solely responsible for this young person who is in tears. A number of things. Make sure you've briefed them on what the space is. So in all staff, whether you do the whole staff briefing or whether you just pick on certain members, but the pastoral staff should know what this space is about and invite them to come see it. We all know that staff members love sneaking in anyway, so you might as well invite them to come and see it officially, so they know what the young people are going to be doing. And there's two ways this is helpful. Firstly, it means that they can let you know of any issues that they know of that you might need to know of. So, for example, if you're doing anything on grief or bereavement or anything like that, they may be able to say to you, actually, this happened, last week, or we've got a student coming in whose mum died, and, she'll be in this class this day. You're probably going to see her, just so you know to look out for her. Or they may be able to say, oh, actually, just so you know, that's going to be a bit of a hot topic for one of the students that's coming in. And it's a great resource for you to know maybe some of the buttons you might be pushing, because you don't want to just go in and completely, throw chaos into the school. The second way it's helpful is it lets the pastoral staff know what they're going to be dealing with. And I think it's really important for us to remember that we won't be the only people seeing the emotional response of the young people in the prayer space. It's only a very specific young person that's very comfortable to cry in front of their classmates, and also a very specific young person that's willing to talk one-to-one with someone they may not have met before. An emotional response for a young person might be completely lashing out the rest of the day because the prayer space has brought something up that they're not comfortable with. We can't guarantee that we're going to be the people that they want to talk to in that moment. And letting the pastoral staff know what may be coming up is going to be really helpful for them as well. And I don't think it's fair that we kind of come in and throw like an emotional bomb into the school and then just back away. I think it's really important that the support staff are used in that way. So the next thing is just working out how you're going to work with them in that. And that's just about knowing, having a good relationship with them anyway, so that communication is clear. There's two examples I can give of this, one very good and one very bad. The very bad one was we had a young lad that was really touched by a activity that we had, but he made it clear he didn't really want to speak to anybody in the room. He said he was all right, but he was clearly quite upset. He'd been crying. But he didn't want to talk to anybody. So at the end of it, I went down to the pastoral room and I just said, look, this lad, he's really responded to this. Just so you know, can you just keep a lookout for him just to make sure he's all right? At that moment, he walked past and the pastoral support lady yelled out at him, "Oi, I hear you've been crying in the prayer room." Right, I just wanted it to die, and not surprisingly, the lad just walked off, right? Okay, bad example. Good example is we had a young girl who, bless her, was just kind of crying in the corner, And one of the main things is not to draw attention to it. Please don't be like, oh, tears, yes, right? Okay, like that's not the great thing to do. The good thing is just to go over quietly and check they're okay. And there was a member of staff in the room with us, and she just gently went over, knelt down next to her, said, are you okay? Turned out it was something to do with her mum. And she said, all right, well, how about you come to my room at lunchtime and we'll just have a bit of a chat about it. The girl sort of went, okay, and calmed down a bit, knew that it was going to be dealt with. You've passed it on to the right person. Brilliant. You don't have to worry about it anymore. And I think that is just, for me, the best example. And so it's also remembering that your job is not to be the sole responsibility for that young person. You are not a counsellor. Your team are not counsellors. You are to pass the pastoral situation on to the people who are meant to be dealing with the pastoral situation. And I think sometimes we feel a bit like, because it's a prayer space and they've obviously responded to something going on, therefore as the spiritual guidance, we must be the people that deal with it. No, that's not your job. And it's really important just to remember that and not feel like you've got to be the person that knows everything and is able to deal with everything that comes up. We've already, actually, I was going to talk a little bit about safeguarding, but I think it's been covered brilliantly already. The main thing is to say, know the policies of the school, have your own policy, and make sure your team know it. The CYO team, we kind of have a mantra for going into school, which is don't take secrets out of the school. And actually in prayer spaces, that's a really helpful thing to remember and to pass to your staff. Don't take secrets out of school. If anything has been said or if anything has been written down and you are concerned about it, you don't go out of that school that day without anyone within the school knowing that should know about it. I've have tissues. That may sound really obvious, but the last thing you want is to send someone off to the toilet to get some loo roll because it doesn't quite have the same feel. But again, not about manipulation. Don't give this to a young person oh, you might need this later. But just have them available. And some of the questions maybe for you to think about is with your team. Are you thinking pastorally when you bring people in, or are you just looking for manpower and people that can use MP3 players? Is that just your list, or actually are you thinking about the people you're bringing in and whether you've got pastoral people within your team so that when you're tied up trying to lead the session, you've got people you can trust who are going to be the people to go and chat to the students. And also knowing your team, knowing what gifts they have, and knowing if they're going to be the right person to send over to something. So we had a brilliant example where a young girl had come in from the sixth form and was clearly upset over something. And we had a girl with us, and Tim just said to her, look, I think maybe something's going on over there. Do you think you can go talk to her? And she did. And the brilliant question was, are these good tears or bad tears? Brilliant question. Write that down. That's a great question, because the girl was like, oh, they're happy tears, and she was able to talk about it. But it was knowing that she was the right person for that situation. So just kind of getting your head out of the educational, this is a project and we need as many volunteers as possible space, and actually thinking pastorally, who are you bringing in? And then I just want to flip it around a little bit, because it's very easy to think what happens if pastoral situations happen to come up in a prayer space. But as someone who works mainly in pastoral care in a school, I want to turn around a little bit and think about using a prayer space as a pastoral resource. And this is something that I've been really challenged about as I've been writing this talk, really. As a school chaplain, whether right or wrong, I can sometimes feel a little bit threatened by the idea of prayer spaces. Now, whether that's just because I want my street cred to be really cool and I don't want the idea of something else coming in and maybe threatening that, I don't know. But the idea of, my young people in a prayer space, what's that going to mean? Are they going to like it? What is, all this work I've been doing, all this work for them. And that's really challenged me as I've been thinking about this, that actually, what an incredible opportunity as someone who knows these young people to then bring something else in. Now, if you do mentoring with students, there is only so far your words can go. There's only so many things you can say to a student. And actually, as I've been thinking about this, I've been thinking, actually, what an incredible thing a prayer space would be, because it would go beyond any words that I could give that young person. There's a young lad I work with. I want to tell you his story. He's currently now year 11, and mum and dad split up quite a few years ago. He lived with mum for a couple of months until she made it very clear to him that he didn't want her. She didn't want him living with her anymore. And she told him he had to go and live with dad because she didn't want him anymore. So he moved in with Dad, who now had a new wife, so that was stepmom. And they immediately told him that they didn't want him either. And he's now kind of in a very mixed up battle between his parents over who wants him the least. And he has to stay with the one that's willing to put up with him that month. There are only so many things I can say to this lad about worth and identity and value. There are only so many things I can do with him because I am just me. What does a prayer space mean for him? And that is the question that has really got me excited again about pastoral care and prayer spaces. Not thinking about, what might happen if we happen to bring this in and, some young person responds to it, but thinking about the young people that I know and that I love and I care for. What would a prayer space mean for them? What would it mean for this young lad to come into a space? What would I want it to say for him? What activities could it include that would talk to him about worth and value and identity and meaning? That's an incredible gift to bring into a school that goes beyond me as a person. Bill Hybels once said that the best thing you can do for someone is introduce them to the God who loves them. And when I think about a prayer space, I think about there is only so much I can do. And yet actually we've seen the experiences young people have when they come into these prayer spaces of something other and something they encounter that's beyond words, as evidenced by that girl who felt loved and understood when no words were spoken. And so the challenge I want to leave with you is thinking about pastoral care and prayer spaces is not just how are you thinking pastorally when you're planning them, but also how are you using them as a pastoral resource in the work you are doing. Who is that one young person that you tell the story of, like my lad? Who is that one guy that your heart breaks when you think of? Who is that girl that you're really, really worried about? And if you were to do a prayer space for them, what would that look like? And let that be an inspiration for the work you're doing. So I think we're going to have some discussion time now.